So in this session, I want to talk about how to deal with our doubts in a practical way. When we go through those seasons where it feels like our faith is failing, how can we continue to have faith? And I think C.S. Lewis gives us a really good place to begin because as we saw, when he went through his season of doubt, he came to the conclusion that the most important thing in his faith wasn't necessarily having all the answers, although the answers are out there. But for him, that wasn't the most important thing. The most important thing for him was having an intimate, honest, real, authentic, gritty relationship with God. Lewis discovered that it's sometimes in the absence of answers that faith is born. And I think it's kind of this way in any relationship. So I think about my own wife, Elisa. There's so much I know about my wife. She's a morning person. She loves to cook. She loves to garden. She is into interior design. She used to like cats, and then she repented, and we got a golden doodle. Actually, we have a cat too. God's working on me with that. There's a lot I know about her. She's an incredible person. But there are also times when she'll surprise me. There are times when maybe she's sharing a story with me and I find out something about her past, like, oh, wow, I didn't know that about you. Or she'll share, a response to a situation in a way that I didn't see coming. Or we open up Spotify and because we share an account, I see, oh, wow, you've been listening to that song. Fascinating. There are times in our relationship where she'll surprise me. There are times when, oh, I'm still learning about her. And I actually think that's a good thing, that's a healthy thing, because if you're married or in a relationship, if you literally knew everything about the other person, what kind of relationship would that be? Yeah, boring. If I literally knew everything about my wife, if I knew every placement of every atom, if I knew every thought that she had before she spoke it, if I literally knew wherever she was at any given second, like, not only would that be slightly creepy, I think it would hinder the progression of love. It's because I don't know everything about her that the relationship feels so alive. It's because there are secrets that are waiting to be unearthed. There are questions that are aching to be asked. There are dimensions of her I've yet to fully explore or understand. It's the pursuit of love that leads to the discovery of love. Or we could put it this way: mystery is the lifeblood of intimacy. And what if the same thing is true in our relationship with God? What if God created the world and us in such a way where doubt is part of the package, where we're going to have questions, and what if it's His way of pushing us and inviting us and calling us to wrestle, to go further and deeper than we ever have before? And I think one of the most practical ways that we can do this is through prayer. Prayer is what gets us deeper into the heart of God. And instead of suppressing our doubts or hiding our doubts or idolizing our doubts, we bring them honestly and authentically before God. We find there in that space that we discover things about His character and His nature and His love towards us that maybe we hadn't encountered before. One of my favorite examples of this comes from the Old Testament, Exodus 32, the story of Jacob. Jacob, of course, his story was soaked in doubt. He doubted at one point his calling, even doubted God's character and presence. He doubted his own character. Jacob's name literally means heel grabber or conniver. I heard one pastor say, dirty, sneaky thief is a good translation. So he had all these doubts that were part of his story. And God wanted to draw that out of him and deepen him and change him. So in Genesis 32, God wrestled with Jacob all night. He was the very first wrestler, or if you're a fan of Nacho Libre, he was the world's first luchador, right? God takes him to the mat. And if you've ever wrestled with someone, I tried it once in high school and it was a complete disaster. Especially if you're an introvert, wrestling is your worst nightmare because you find out things about your opponent you'd rather not know. It's intimate, it's sweaty, it involves armpits. And this is what God does with Jacob. He takes him to the mat, he wrestles with him. Why? Because God wanted to draw that stuff out of Jacob, and He wanted Jacob to encounter faith in a way that was his own. At one point, God said, What is your name? Why? Was it because God didn't know? No, of course he knew. He asked him his name because he wanted Jacob to own his name. Okay, I'm Yaakov, dirty, sneaky thief. I'm the conniver. I'm the heel grabber. And God says, I'm going to change your name now from Jacob to Israel, which means he who wrestles with God. And I share that story because like Jacob, God wants to change us. He wants to change me. He wants to deepen us. He wants to call us Israel, but that can only happen if we're willing to go to the mat and hold nothing back. And that means having the guts to tell him our name. It means peeling off the mask so that he can see who we really are. And it means being brutally honest with our doubts before him. So if we're confused or offended by what we read in Scripture, we don't just dismiss it or over-spiritualize it or hide it. We ask God the tough questions. We tell him what we think. God can handle it. We bring those uncertainties before him. If we're struggling with the silence of God, we don't just settle for silence. We make some noise. We press in. We ask God to speak. If we're struggling to understand why God would allow suffering and pain and evil, we don't repress it or pretend that it's not an issue, because it is. Like David in the book of Psalms, we share with him our wounds and the wounds of others. And we're not afraid to ask why. We're not ashamed of our tears. We give space in our life for what the Hebrews called lament. The only way that superficial faith becomes genuine faith is by speaking truth. So it's when we wrestle, when we question, when we agonize, when we doubt, when we name our tears and our fears, that's when we're set free. And that's when the Jacob in us can become Israel. So we wrestle with God. We bring those doubts before God. But not only that, number two, we need to bring our doubts to others and wrestle with others in community. This is so key. Nancy Pearcey, brilliant thinker, she wrote this. A recent study by Fuller Seminary found that when teens graduate from high school, they often graduate from God as well. But the researchers also discovered one factor that proved most effective in helping young people maintain their Christian convictions. What would you expect it to be? More prayer? More Bible study? As important as those things are, surprisingly, the most significant factor was whether they had a safe space to wrestle with doubts and questions, this is interesting, before leaving home. The study concluded the more college students felt that they had the opportunity to express their doubt while they were in high school, the higher their levels of faith maturity and spiritual maturity. So it turns out one of the most practical ways that we can deal with our doubt is in community. We weren't meant to wrestle with our doubts alone. And this idea is seen all over the Bible. A few years ago, I did a study on the one another's in the Bible. Did you know that phrase, one another, is found 59 times in the New Testament? Now, I won't give you all 59, but here's 10. Love one another. Be devoted to one another. Live in harmony with one another. Serve one another. Be kind and compassionate to one another. Submit to one another. Forgive one another. Encourage one another. Pray for one another. Carry one another's burdens. Now think about this in the context of doubt. When we're struggling with doubt, we have to remember that we don't have to go through it alone. As followers of Jesus, by definition, we're in community. He calls us the body of Jesus, right? We're all part of the body of Jesus. It's big, it's gawky sometimes, even dysfunctional at times. It's wonderful, it's beautiful. He calls it his bride, his church, and every single one of us have a part to play in the body of Jesus. Some people are the hands, they love to serve. Some are the mouth, they love to talk. Some are the eyes, they have vision. Some are the knees, they love to pray. Some are the appendix, we don't know what they do, right? We all have these different parts to play in the body of Jesus. So church then isn't a place where we hide our doubts, our weaknesses, and our wounds. Church is a place where our weaknesses, doubts, and wounds can be redeemed. Anne Lamott, she's an author. In one of her books, she talks about how the ancient Chinese, when they had a vessel, if that vessel got a crack in it or a break in it, rather than throwing the whole vessel away, you know what they would do? It's so beautiful. They would take this very, very thin gold leaf, and they would go to the place where that crack was, that break was in the jar, and they would cover it, not to hide the break, but rather the opposite, to draw attention to it. It was their way of saying, we're not going to pretend that the brokenness doesn't exist, because it does. Instead, we're going to own it, we're going to share it, and we're going to turn it into something beautiful. And I think Christian community at its best is that. It's when we can be real with others, with our doubts. Like we saw, the one another's. We're carrying one another's burdens. Be merciful to those who doubt. We're being honest with the real and wounded us, and then allowing ourselves to be adorned with the gold leaf of grace. Community is the liberating choice to let others see us at our worst so that they can see God at his best. I love this quote by Eugene Peterson. He said, "Pain entered into, accepted, and owned can become poetry." In community, our doubts can become poetry. And this is true in all relationships. Mystery is the lifeblood of intimacy. And it's true in our relationships with others, that when we're honest, when we're not suppressing our doubts or hiding from the questions, but opening up with people, hey, I'm struggling with this, or could you pray with me for that? It's then that our faith has room to grow. This is true emotionally, it's true relationally, and it's also true in the life of the mind. And that's what I want to talk about next.